It was a cold February morning in 1587 when the doors of Fotheringhay Castle creaked open. Inside, a queen who had once ruled Scotland and claimed the throne of England was led to her final hour. Draped in black, clutching a crucifix, Mary Stuart Mary, Queen of Scots, walked toward the executioner's block. Her life had been filled with crowns, betrayals, and relentless ambition, but in that moment, history would remember her not for her power, but for her tragic end. Yet, behind that execution lay a story far more complex, a tale of love and treachery, of rival queens locked in a deadly game, of religion tearing nations apart, and of one woman who became both a symbol of hope and a dangerous threat. Mary's death was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her legend. Before we step into this tale of ambition, betrayal, and blood, let me ask you, where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments below, because it always amazes me how these hidden stories bring us together across centuries and continents. And if you enjoy exploring the forgotten chapters of history, make sure you subscribe and join us, because here on Secret Historians, we uncover the stories the textbooks chose to forget. ChatGPT, Harika, O. Zaman Kindi's Secret Historians, the Phantom Queen, Mary, Queen of Scots Hycumizin Chapter 1 Casmina, Baslatiorum, Bulbablumd Odic, Mary Stuart in Dogumu, Erkin Kokakluku, Franzia Jondralegi, Crawley Click Unvanning, Kukakyarda Kazan Mask, Ve Tatangalgendi Biumesi. Chapter 1. Picture this. It is December 1542, in the cold stone halls of Linlithgow Palace, Scotland. A newborn cries out in the night, her voice echoing through chambers that had so recently echoed with the groans of her dying father. That infant is Mary Stuart Mary, Queen of Scots, born into a world already burdened by expectation and conflict. For just 7 days earlier, her father, King James V of Scotland, had breathed his last, leaving behind not a grown heir to secure the Stuart line, but this tiny, vulnerable child. In that instant, she was queen, though she could not yet speak her own name. From the very beginning, Mary's life was defined by fragility and danger. Scotland was a kingdom perched precariously between two greater powers, England to the south and France across the sea. To the English, led by King Henry VIII, her birth was both an opportunity and a threat. Henry saw in Mary a chance to unite the crowns of Scotland and England through marriage to his young son Edward. But to the Scots, fiercely protective of their independence, such a union smelled of conquest and submission. Before Mary had even left her cradle, her very body had become a prize in a game of nations. Her mother, Mary of Guise, a French noblewoman of formidable intellect and steel, recognized the peril. Widowed and thrust into the role of regent, she knew that her daughter's survival depended on strategy as much as on faith. She wrapped Mary in layers of silk and secrecy, surrounding her with loyal attendants, and began plotting a path that would tie Scotland more closely to France rather than to England. For in France, the Guise family wielded power like a sword, and they would see their bloodline elevated further through this infant queen. Imagine being that child, raised not as an ordinary girl, but as a monarch from the moment she opened her eyes. Even as an infant, Mary's days were marked by ceremony nobles bowing before her, prayers intoned for her long life, and documents sealed in her name, though she had no idea of their meaning. But ceremony was no shield against the ambitions of her enemies. Henry VIII pressed his claim, seeking to bind Scotland to England through the rough wooing, a brutal series of campaigns meant to force Mary into marriage with his son. Villages burned, castles fell, and the message was clear. Mary's hand in marriage was worth war itself. By the time she was 5, it was decided that Scotland was too dangerous for her. If she remained, she might be captured or assassinated before reaching adulthood. So, under the cover of night, the little queen was carried to the coast and placed aboard a ship bound for France. The sea voyage was perilous, storms battering the vessel, but at last she arrived safely in the glittering courts of the French Valois dynasty. There, Mary would not only find refuge, she would be molded into a queen of two kingdoms. France dazzled her young eyes. Where Scotland had been grey stone and mist, France was light, color, and spectacle. At the French court, she was treated with honor, not merely as a guest, but as a future bride. Betrothed to the Dauphin Francis, son of King Henry II, Mary became a central figure in the dynastic chessboard of Europe. Her education was entrusted to the finest minds. She learned French, Latin, Italian, and even a bit of Spanish. She mastered music, dance, embroidery, and falconry, the refined arts of nobility. And perhaps most importantly, she absorbed the courtly elegance that would make her stand out among queens. Those who saw her as a child remarked on her beauty, her intelligence, and her charm. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight, eyes that seemed always to carry a glimmer of wit, and a tall, graceful frame that made her appear older than her years. She was quick with words, fond of poetry, and blessed with a charisma that made people lean in when she spoke. Even as a girl, she seemed destined to command hearts as much as crowns. Yet beneath the silks and dances, danger still lingered. For every ally she gained in France, she made an enemy in England. Queen Mary, the first later remembered as Bloody Mary, watched her young namesake with wary eyes, knowing that some already whispered that the Scottish queen might one day press a claim to England's throne. When Elizabeth Tudor later rose to power, that rivalry would turn deadly. But in those early years, the shadow of England was always present, hovering just beyond the glitter of the French court. When she was just 15, Mary was wed to Francis, the Dauphin of France. The wedding was a spectacle of magnificence, celebrated with tournaments, feasts, and music that filled the air of Paris. Dressed in a gown of white and silver, with pearls woven into her hair, Mary seemed the very image of a fairy tale queen. In marrying Francis, she had become not only the Queen of Scots, but the future Queen of France. For a brief moment, she stood poised to rule two kingdoms, her future blazing brighter than any queen of her age. But fate has a cruel way of twisting joy into sorrow. Francis was frail, sickly, and unprepared for the burdens of kingship. When his father died and Francis became King of France, Mary rose to the pinnacle of power beside him. Yet their reign lasted barely a year. Francis, weak from illness, died in 1560 at just 16 years old. In an instant, Mary was widowed, her French crown lost, her future once again uncertain. Now imagine her at 18 once queen of two realms, now a widow stranded in a foreign court that no longer needed her. France had been a golden cage, but it was still a cage, and with Francis gone, her position was tenuous. Whispers grew louder. She was a foreigner, a liability, a queen without a throne. So Mary turned her eyes homeward. Scotland, the land she had left as a child, called her back. But Scotland was no longer the kingdom she remembered. It was a realm divided, torn by the storms of the Reformation, where Protestant lords and Catholic loyalists battled for the soul of the nation. To return was to step into fire. Yet Mary had little choice. She was a queen, and a queen must have a throne. And so, in the summer of 1561, Mary Stuart sailed back across the sea. The mists of Scotland rose once more before her, gray and foreboding, as if warning her of what awaited. She was no longer the child who had left, but a woman now charming, intelligent, ambitious, and determined. But she was also vulnerable, for in returning to her native land, she would find not welcome but suspicion, not loyalty but betrayal. For Mary, Queen of Scots, the stage was set, and the drama that would consume her life was only beginning. Asterisk. The summer of 1561 brought with it gray skies, cold winds, and the return of a queen who had left her homeland as a child. As Mary Stuart's ship cut through the mist and approached Leith, the port of Edinburgh, the people gathered to see her. Some craned their necks with excitement, curious to glimpse the young queen they had heard about in ballads and rumors. Others whispered in suspicion, fearful that the Catholic widow returning from France would bring foreign influence and papal control into a land now gripped by the fires of Protestant reform. Mary was 18 tall, striking and radiating a poise that belied her years. She spoke with the grace of the French court, her manners polished, her words smooth as silk. But Scotland was no France. The kingdom she returned to was turbulent, raw, and divided. The Protestant Reformation had spread like wildfire, led by fierce voices such as John Knox, who thundered from pulpits that no woman should rule, and that Mary herself was little more than an instrument of Rome's corruption. Imagine her arrival in Edinburgh Castle, the drums beating, banners flying, and yet beneath the spectacle, a tension sharp enough to cut the air. Mary had been raised in luxury, in courts of velvet and music, yet now she faced a nobility hardened by war and suspicion. These were men who had fought against English invasions, who had burned monasteries, who had already tasted the power of ruling in a queen's absence. They would not easily bow to a woman, much less one whose faith stood at odds with their own. But Mary was no timid ruler. She played her part with brilliance, smiling as though every cheer was genuine, as though every suspicious gaze was a pledge of loyalty. She attended Protestant services to calm fears, even though her heart and her private prayers remained Catholic. She rode out among the people, charming them with her fluency, her elegance, and her willingness to listen. For a brief moment, it seemed she might hold the fragile balance between factions. Yet the greatest threat to Mary's rule was not only within Scotland's borders, it was across the southern frontier. Elizabeth Tudor sat upon the throne of England, and though the two queens never met face to face, their lives became a mirror of rivalry. Elizabeth was Protestant, unmarried and cautious. Mary was Catholic, widowed, and ambitious. And while Elizabeth's legitimacy had long been questioned due to her father's tumultuous marriages, Mary's bloodline gave her a stronger claim in the eyes of many Catholics to the English throne itself. It is here that the story becomes more than a tale of two queens. It becomes a deadly game of identity and inheritance. Mary, Queen of Scots, believed herself the rightful heir to England if Elizabeth should die without a child. Elizabeth, ever watchful, recognized the danger of such a claim. Every Catholic rebellion in England, every whisper of discontent, seemed to carry Mary's name upon the wind. But Mary, returning to Scotland, was not yet prepared to strike openly against her cousin. Instead, she focused on solidifying her power at home. She reorganized her court, bringing with her attendants from France who sparked jealousy among the Scottish nobles. She cultivated alliances with families she thought she could trust, yet she quickly learned that in Scotland loyalty was as fleeting as the Highland mist. Her charm, though, was undeniable. Wherever she went, she captivated hearts. Men spoke of her beauty and wit. Poets praised her grace. Foreign ambassadors wrote admiringly of her presence. Yet this very charisma fueled suspicion among those who feared she would use her allure not only to govern but to manipulate. John Knox railed against her in fiery sermons, declaring that she was more dangerous than any army, for she threatened the very soul of the nation. Mary tried to silence Knox, summoning him before her in a dramatic confrontation. Imagine the scene: the young queen, regal and commanding, sitting in her chamber as the preacher, fierce and unyielding, declared to her face that her rule was against divine law. She wept, some say, at his words, whether from frustration or from the sting of his defiance. But the message was clear. In Scotland, her crown was not absolute. She could charm, she could persuade, but she could not bend the faith of a nation. Still, Mary held her ground. She attended tournaments, organized hunts, presided over banquets, and sought to project stability. For several years after her return, she managed a delicate peace, navigating the treacherous waters of factional politics. Yet beneath the surface, the currents of discontent grew stronger. The nobles whispered of her possible remarriage. Who would she choose, and what alliances would that choice bring? Elizabeth herself offered suitors, hoping to control Mary's hand in marriage, knowing that the man she chose could shift the balance of power in Europe. And so Mary stood at a crossroads, still young, still radiant, still commanding, yet already ensnared in the traps of politics, religion, and ambition. Her very existence was a threat to Elizabeth, her every choice a spark in the powder keg of Scotland. The question was no longer whether Mary could rule Scotland. The question was whether she could survive it. By the mid-1560s, Mary Stuart was in her early 20s, still youthful, still radiant, but already hardened by the weight of her crown. Her return to Scotland had brought both admiration and suspicion, yet she remained unmarried, and that fact alone made her reign precarious. A queen without a husband was a queen without an anchor, and every courtier, every ambassador, every rival monarch had an opinion on whom she should wed. Marriage for Mary was not about romance, it was about power. But in choosing her partner, she would set into motion events that would haunt her forever. Elizabeth of England understood this better than anyone. To keep her cousin under control, Elizabeth dangled suitors before her, each carefully selected to keep Mary dependent or harmless. Yet Mary, fiery and independent, resisted Elizabeth's puppetry. She would choose for herself. And then came Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Tall, striking, with golden hair and noble blood, Darnley was a figure of charm at first sight. He was Mary's cousin, sharing Tudor lineage through Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. This made him not only a suitable match in terms of blood, but also a dangerous one, for their union would strengthen Mary's already formidable claim to the English throne. To the Catholic world, they would be the golden couple destined to unite Scotland, England, and perhaps even restore the old faith. When Mary met Darnley, she was captivated. His youth, his grace in dancing, his ease in conversation, he seemed the very image of a knight sprung from a ballad. Against the counsel of her advisers, against the cautious maneuvers of Elizabeth, she chose him. In 1565, they were married in a ceremony that dazzled the Scottish court. Bells rang, feasts were held, and Mary appeared radiant beside her handsome new husband. To her subjects, it looked as though stability had arrived at last. But beneath the gilded surface, cracks spread quickly. Darnley was not the man Mary had imagined. Handsome he might have been, but beneath his golden locks lay arrogance, ambition, and weakness. He was jealous of Mary's power, resentful that as her husband he was not made king in name as well as in fact. He drank heavily, consorted with dubious companions, and lashed out at anyone who threatened his fragile pride. Mary's charm, which had once drawn him, soon became a source of suspicion. He could not bear her authority, nor the loyalty she inspired in men more capable than he. One man in particular drew his wrath, David Rizzio, Mary's Italian secretary. Rizzio was a musician, clever and cultured, who had risen to prominence in Mary's court. He was her confidant, her companion in music and politics, and his influence enraged Darnley. Rumors spread that Rizzio was more than a secretary, that perhaps he was her lover, though evidence was thin. For Darnley, rumor was enough. The storm broke in March 1566. One evening, Mary was dining with Rizzio and several ladies at Holyrood Palace when the doors burst open. Darnley entered with a band of armed men, their faces set in grim determination. Before Mary's horrified eyes, they dragged Rizzio from the table. He clung to her skirts, begging for her protection, But she, pregnant and powerless in that moment, could not save him. The assassin stabbed Rizzio more than 50 times, his blood pooling on the floor beneath the tapestries. Imagine the scene. A young queen, heavy with child, forced to watch her closest friend butchered at her very feet. The shock must have been searing, the betrayal unbearable. For this was not only an act of jealousy, it was a message. Darnley had shown her that even in her own palace, surrounded by her own guards, she was vulnerable. Yet Mary was no victim to be broken. She turned her fury into strategy. She feigned reconciliation with Darnley, smiling through gritted teeth, assuring him of her forgiveness. But inside, she plotted. She knew now what her husband was capable of, and she knew that he was not the partner she needed. Their marriage deteriorated swiftly. Darnley's arrogance grew. His drinking worsened, and his alliances shifted dangerously. Nobles who had once supported the match now murmured against him, disgusted by his weakness and his cruelty. Mary gave birth to a son, James, in June 1566, a child who would one day inherit both the Scottish and English crowns. For that, history would remember her. But in the moment, her joy at motherhood was poisoned by the presence of the man she now despised. Darnley himself seemed aware of his growing isolation. He fell ill perhaps with smallpox, perhaps with syphilis, and in his weakness, he reached out to Mary, pleading for reconciliation. She visited him, spoke kindly, but the bond between them was shattered. Trust, once broken, could never be restored. And then came the night of February 10th, 1567. Darnley was staying at Kirk O. Field, a house in Edinburgh, recovering from his illness. Mary had visited him earlier that evening, speaking gently, leaving him with the impression that perhaps all was not lost. Hours later, in the dead of night, a violent explosion shattered the stillness. The house was torn apart by gunpowder, the blast echoing across the city. But when the rubble was searched, Darnley's body was not found in the wreckage. Instead, it lay in the garden, untouched by fire, with strangulation marks upon his neck. The mystery was immediate and enduring. Who had killed Lord Darnley? The explosion was clearly meant as a cover, but the manner of his death suggested something more intimate, more deliberate. Whispers filled the streets of Edinburgh. Fingers pointed in every direction. Some said it was Mary herself, desperate to be rid of a treacherous husband. Others accused her advisers, particularly James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a powerful noble who had grown close to the Queen. Whatever the truth, the murder of Darnley would prove to be the turning point of Mary's reign. In trying to free herself from one chain, she had walked into another trap, one that would close tighter with every passing day. For now, Scotland's queen was not simply a monarch beset by rivals. She was a widow once more, but this time she was also a suspect, and the shadow of Darnley's death would follow her to her grave. The cold February night that ended, Lord Darnley's life left more than rubble in Edinburgh's streets. It left a kingdom in shock. Whispers spread faster than fire, carrying suspicion like a plague. Who had orchestrated the death of the young lord? Why had his body been found strangled, untouched by the explosion? And most dangerously, what role had Mary, Queen of Scots, played in the tragedy? For days, the court buzzed with rumors. Some swore they had seen shadowy figures slipping through the night near Kirk O. Field. Others claimed that barrels of gunpowder could only have been placed there with the knowledge of powerful men. The name that rose again and again was James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was no stranger to scandal. He was bold, cunning, and ambitious, a man of towering presence and ruthless pragmatism. He had long been close to Mary, his loyalty tested in battles and councils alike. To some, he was her protector. To others, her corrupter. And when Darnley's body was found, suspicion fell heavily upon him. Yet, in a display of audacity, Bothwell demanded a trial to clear his name. The trial was swift, perhaps too swift. Witnesses were scarce, evidence thin, and powerful nobles ensured that Bothwell walked free. To the public, it smelled not of justice, but of manipulation. And when, only weeks later, Bothwell and Mary were seen together more frequently riding, conversing, even laughing, the whispers turned into accusations. Imagine the sight: a widowed queen, not yet out of mourning, appearing in public beside the very man suspected of her husband's murder. To her enemies, it was proof. To her supporters, it was troubling. And then, in April of 1567, events took a shocking turn. Mary was traveling when Bothwell intercepted her with armed men. Some accounts say he abducted her against her will, forcing her to his stronghold at Fotheringhay Castle. Others suggest that Mary went willingly, complicit in a plan to silence her critics and seize control of her destiny. The truth, as with so much of her life, lies shrouded in ambiguity. What is certain is that within weeks, Mary married Bothwell. The wedding was no fairy tale. Mary appeared in black, the traditional color of mourning, and the ceremony carried an air of unease. Many of her nobles refused to attend. To the people of Scotland, the union was scandalous. Here was their queen, bound to the man many believed had murdered her husband. Whether she was victim or accomplice mattered little. Perception was damning enough. From that moment, the tide turned against Mary. The lords of Scotland, already uneasy with her Catholic faith and her French manners, now saw an opportunity. They rallied under banners of rebellion, declaring Bothwell guilty and Mary unfit to rule. Armies marched, and within weeks, the Queen found herself confronted not by foreign enemies, but by her own subjects. At Carberry Hill, in June 1567, the confrontation came to a head. Mary and Bothwell faced the rebel lords across the field, banners snapping in the wind, muskets gleaming in the sun. For hours they parleyed, but Mary soon realized her position was untenable. Her forces wavered, her supporters hesitated. At last she rode forward, surrendering herself in a gesture of defiance and despair. Her people turned on her. As she was led through Edinburgh, the crowds jeered, shouting insults, waving banners painted with cruel caricatures of her and Bothwell. They called her adulteress, murderous whore. The Queen, who had once inspired admiration, now inspired rage. Bothwell fled, escaping into exile, his ambitions dashed. Mary was taken captive, imprisoned in the cold walls of Fotheringhay Castle. There, the lords pressed her to abdicate, to renounce her crown in favor of her infant son, James. With no allies, no freedom, and no hope of escape, she signed the document. Her baby boy was crowned King James VI of Scotland, while she, his mother, languished in captivity. Imagine the weight of that moment. A queen who had once been courted by kings, crowned in France, adored in Scotland, now reduced to a prisoner, her crown taken, her reputation shattered. The once bright promise of her reign now lay in ruins, tarnished by scandal, betrayal, and the unyielding judgment of her people. Yet Mary was not finished. Queens do not surrender easily, and Mary Stuart was nothing if not resilient. From her prison, she began to plan. Allies still existed. Loyalists who believed her downfall was unjust. The question was not whether she would fight to reclaim her throne, but how and at what cost. The wheel of fate had turned, but it had not stopped. And for Mary, Queen of Scots, the next chapter would be even more perilous than the last. The stone walls of Fotheringhay Castle were meant to hold her forever, but Mary Stuart was not a woman who accepted her fate quietly. In 1567, she was just 24 years old, a prisoner queen stripped of her crown, her child taken from her, her reputation shattered. Yet even in captivity, her spirit burned. She wrote letters to allies, whispered promises to loyal attendants, and searched for cracks in the prison of stone and steel. Loch Leven was a fortress set on an island in the middle of a cold Scottish loch. It was bleak, isolated, and watched over by those who despised her. Still, Mary found sympathizers among the servants, men who saw in her not a criminal, but their rightful queen. With their help, she began to weave a plan. On a May evening in 1568, the opportunity came. Disguised as a servant, Mary slipped through the castle gates. She boarded a small boat waiting at the water's edge, her heart racing as the oars cut silently through the dark waters. Behind her, the castle loomed like a tomb she had narrowly escaped. Ahead lay freedom and the chance to reclaim her throne. News of her escape spread like wildfire. Loyalists rallied, banners were raised, and within days she commanded an army of 6,000 men. The Queen was back, and for a brief moment, hope flickered across Scotland. She rode at the head of her forces, tall, defiant, her face set with determination. It seemed as if destiny might yet bend in her favor, but her enemies were ready. Regent Moray, ruling on behalf of her infant son, marched to confront her with a disciplined army. On May 13, 1568, the two forces met at Langside, near Glasgow. Mary's troops were eager, but poorly organized. Moray's men were experienced, hardened, and strategically placed. The battle was swift and brutal. Moray's forces struck with precision, breaking Mary's army before it had time to form. Her soldiers fled in panic, cut down as they ran. From a distance, Mary watched the disaster unfold. One moment she had dreamed of restoration. The next, she was a fugitive once more. Riding hard across the countryside, she sought safety. But Scotland was no longer safe for her. Betrayed by nobles, abandoned by allies, pursued by enemies, she made a desperate choice. She would cross the border into England and throw herself upon the mercy of her cousin, Elizabeth Tudor. That it was a gamble, perhaps the greatest gamble of her life. Elizabeth was queen of a Protestant realm that had long seen Mary as a threat. Yet Mary hoped that cousinly sympathy, or at least dynastic solidarity, might protect her. After all, she was an anointed monarch, unjustly deposed. Surely Elizabeth, herself a woman who had fought for legitimacy, would understand. On May 16, 1568, Mary crossed into England. She was weary, disheveled, yet still regal in her bearing. She sent word to Elizabeth, requesting an audience, hoping for refuge, and perhaps even support in regaining her throne. But instead of a royal welcome, she found herself placed under guard. Elizabeth faced a dilemma. To protect, Mary was to invite rebellion among English Protestants and risk the wrath of nobles who feared a Catholic restoration. To condemn her outright was to spill royal blood, a dangerous precedent. So Elizabeth chose a third path. Mary would be held, not as a guest, but as a prisoner cloaked in courtesy. Thus began a new chapter in Mary's life, not as Queen of Scotland, not as Queen of France, but as a captive queen in England. For nearly 2 decades, she would live behind walls, a prisoner whose very presence threatened Elizabeth's throne. Imagine the bitterness of that moment. Mary had fled Scotland, believing she might return triumphant. Instead, she found herself trapped in another gilded cage, surrounded not by loyalists, but by guards, her letters intercepted, her every move scrutinized. Her dreams of restoration now rested not on her armies, but on the shifting tides of European politics, and the hope that someday Elizabeth might falter. But Mary was not done weaving her web. In her captivity, she would conspire, plot, and reach for power with the same determination that had carried her through battlefields and betrayals. The crown was gone, but the fire still burned. Her fate, however, was no longer in her hands. By crossing into England, Mary had placed her life in the grip of her greatest rival. And Elizabeth Tudor, cautious and calculating, would never forget that her cousin was not just a prisoner, but a claimant to her throne. For most queens, imprisonment lasted days, months, perhaps a few years before rescue or release. For Mary Stuart, it lasted nearly 2 decades. From 1568 until 1587, she lived not as a monarch, but as a captive, yet never an ordinary prisoner. She was housed in castles and manor houses across England, each one both gilded and grim, with guards at her doors and eyes on her every move. Elizabeth Tudor never allowed Mary to be free, yet she never allowed her to be humiliated either. To kill her outright would have been dangerous to shelter her, political suicide. Instead, Elizabeth kept her cousin in a limbo that was both comfortable and suffocating. Mary dined with fine silver, wore gowns befitting a queen, and had a small household of attendants. But her letters were intercepted, her visitors monitored, her movements restricted. She lived within walls that were velvet on the inside, stone on the outside. Imagine her frustration. Day after day, the same chambers, the same gardens, the same guarded walks under watchful eyes. For a woman once courted by kings, who had ridden at the head of armies, who had been crowned queen of 2 nations, captivity was a torment worse than death. Yet Mary did not surrender to despair. She turned to pen and paper, writing letters to foreign courts, appealing to Catholic monarchs of France and Spain. She reminded them that she was not merely a deposed queen, but the rightful heir to England if Elizabeth remained childless. Her very existence became a rallying cry for Catholics across Europe, who dreamed of restoring the old faith to England's throne. This was the danger Elizabeth feared most. For as long as Mary lived, she was a symbol of queen in exile, a figure around whom conspiracies could form. And indeed, conspiracies grew. Across the years, plot after plot emerged, each more daring than the last. The Ridolfi plot of 1571 aimed to depose Elizabeth and marry Mary to the Duke of Norfolk, with Spanish support. It failed, the Duke was executed, and Mary remained in custody. Then came the Throckmorton plot in 1583, involving French backing and Spanish invasion. Again uncovered, crushed, and Mary's circle grew smaller, but the most dangerous of all was the Babington plot in 1586. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic nobleman, corresponded with Mary about assassinating Elizabeth and placing her on the English throne. Mary, weary of years of confinement, desperate for freedom, allowed herself to be drawn into the scheme. Her letters, smuggled in beer barrels, became her undoing. For unknown to her, Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, had intercepted them all. The evidence was damning. Mary had consented, however cautiously, to Elizabeth's assassination. To Elizabeth's counsel, the decision was clear: Mary must die. Yet Elizabeth hesitated. To execute a fellow monarch, a cousin, a queen, anointed by God, this was no ordinary sentence. It set a precedent that thrones could bleed like common criminals. Still, pressure mounted. Parliament demanded it, nobles insisted upon it, and Walsingham's evidence left little room for mercy. Through it all, Mary maintained her dignity. She denied plotting Elizabeth's murder, insisted on her rights as a queen, and demanded to face judgment, not as a subject, but as a sovereign. But Elizabeth would not meet her face to face. The 2 queens who had defined an age of rivalry never once stood in the same room. Their war was waged through letters, spies, and the blood of those caught in between. By the autumn of 1586, the trial was convened at Fotheringhay Castle. Mary, dressed in black, stood before English commissioners who questioned her with relentless formality. She defended herself with eloquence, refusing to admit guilt, declaring that as a queen she could not be judged by Elizabeth's courts. Yet she also knew the outcome was decided before the trial began, and so she waited. For months she remained at Fotheringhay, praying, writing, preparing herself for the end she now knew was inevitable. Outside, The world whispered of her fate. To Catholics, she was a martyr in waiting. To Protestants, a dangerous conspirator whose death would secure the realm. Elizabeth signed the death warrant in February 1587, but even then she wavered, reluctant to bear the weight of blood. Her council, however, moved swiftly. They feared delay, feared reprieve, feared that Mary's shadow would linger forever if action was not taken. The stage was set. After 19 years of captivity, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, would face the executioner's axe. It was dawn on the 8th of February, 1587. The air around Fotheringhay Castle was bitterly cold, the frost clinging to the stone walls like a shroud. Inside, the halls were unnaturally silent. Soldiers lined the corridors, their armor glinting in the candlelight, their faces solemn. They were not preparing for battle, but for something altogether more unsettling. The execution of a queen. Mary Stuart, now 44, rose early from her bed. 19 years of confinement had left her body weakened, her auburn hair streaked with gray, but her spirit remained unbroken. That morning she dressed not in mourning black, but in a gown of deep crimson beneath a black cloak. Crimson, the color of martyrdom in the Catholic faith. Every detail of her attire was deliberate, chosen to send a message. She would die not as a criminal, but as a martyr for her faith, and her crown dot, as she prepared herself, she prayed aloud, clutching a rosary in her hands. Her attendants wept quietly, unable to mask their grief, but Mary reassured them with calm dignity. "Weep not for me," she said, "but for this realm, so stained by blood." Her voice, witnesses later recalled, carried not fear but certainty, as though she had already made peace with her fate. At around 9 o'clock, the sheriff of Northamptonshire entered her chambers. "It is time, madam," he said. Mary rose, tall and composed, and replied, "I am ready." She walked slowly but firmly, flanked by guards, down the corridors toward the great hall where the scaffold had been erected. The hall was crowded. Hundreds of spectators had gathered. Nobles, officials, soldiers, and servants, all craning their necks to witness history. At the far end, the wooden platform stood draped in black cloth. Upon it, a block, an axe gleaming beside it, and 2 executioners in dark clothing awaited her. The smell of freshly cut timber and candle wax hung heavy in the air. Mary mounted the scaffold with grace, pausing only to look out at the assembly. She spoke clearly, her French-accented English filling the hall. "I am innocent of all crimes, yet I submit to this death willingly. I die in the Catholic faith, a true daughter of the Church. May God forgive those who have thirsted for my blood, as he forgives me." Her words struck the crowd with a hush, for she spoke not like a condemned woman, but like a queen giving her final decree. The executioners knelt before her, begging forgiveness, as was custom. Mary granted it freely, laying her hand gently upon their shoulders. "I forgive you with all my heart," she said, "for now you will end my earthly life, but you cannot touch my soul." Her ladies-in-waiting assisted her as she removed her black cloak, revealing the crimson gown beneath. Gasps rippled through the hall. It was a bold declaration. One last act of defiance. She would die not hidden in shame, but robed in the color of sacrifice. She knelt before the block, kissed the wooden surface, and whispered a final prayer. Placing her head upon it, she stretched out her arms in a gesture that resembled the cross. Her voice, steady until the end, carried her last words. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The executioner raised his axe high. The first blow struck, but did not finish her. A second fell, severing her neck. When it was done, silence filled the hall, stunned, heavy silence. Then, in a grim detail remembered by many, her small dog, hidden beneath her skirts, crept out and lay beside her body, whimpering softly. Even the hardened soldiers turned away at the sight. The crimson gown, the calm defiance, the prayer on her lips all combined to transform Mary's death into something greater than punishment. It was theater, martyrdom, and legend in one. Those who had come expecting to see a traitor's end, instead, witnessed the passing of a queen who embraced death with dignity. Outside, the winter sky was gray, the wind sharp. Within those castle walls, the life of Mary, Queen of Scots, had ended. But her story, far from fading, was only beginning to take root in the imagination of Europe. For in death, she became what she had long feared and long desired, a symbol powerful enough to outlast any throne. When the axe fell at Fotheringhay Castle, it was not only the life of Mary Stuart that ended. It was the closing of a chapter that had haunted England, Scotland, and Europe for decades. Yet in her death, the storm did not cease it, only grew louder. The executioners held up her head for the crowd to see, as custom demanded. But in a chilling twist, the auburn hair slipped from their hands, revealing a wig. Mary's real hair beneath was gray, cropped short by years of confinement. Gasps rippled through the hall. The woman who had once been celebrated for her beauty, who had enchanted courts with her presence, had been reduced to the frailty of age and captivity. It was a moment that stripped away the myth, even as it cemented the legend. News of her death spread swiftly. Couriers galloped across England, carrying word that the Catholic Queen was no more. Some Protestants breathed a sigh of relief, believing the greatest threat to Elizabeth's reign had been extinguished. Yet among Catholics, both in England and abroad, outrage flared. To them, Mary had died a martyr, a queen who had held fast to her faith until the very last breath. In France, her former homeland, black drapes were hung in cathedrals, and masses were said in her memory. In Spain, Philip II took her death as further proof of Elizabeth's heresy, fueling his plans for the Armada that would sail the following year. Across Europe, Mary's name became a rallying cry, her blood a symbol of resistance against Protestant rule. And in England, Elizabeth Tudor found herself haunted by the act she had long delayed. For years she had resisted executing Mary, knowing the precedent it would set. She had signed the death warrant reluctantly, under pressure from her council. When she learned that the deed had been carried out swiftly, without her explicit final word, she raged at her ministers, striking at them with both fury and grief. Whether her anger was genuine or a mask for guilt, none could say. But those close to her knew she carried the burden heavily. Elizabeth had preserved her throne, but at the cost of her soul's peace. Mary's body was buried at Peterborough Cathedral with little ceremony, her grave simple, her presence overshadowed by political necessity. But death does not end the power of symbols. Years later, her son, James VI of Scotland, who would become James I of England, had her remains moved to Westminster Abbey. There, in the very heart of English power, Mary was laid to rest in a tomb as magnificent as any monarch's. Ironically, she achieved in death what she never could in life, a place of honor beside England's kings and queens. Her legacy grew with every retelling. To some, she was a tragic heroine, undone by ambition and betrayal. To others, she was reckless, blinded by passion and poor judgment. But to millions across Europe, she was a saint-like figure, a queen who had chosen faith over compromise, dignity over submission. Imagine the contrast. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, who reigned for decades in caution and pragmatism, remembered for her golden age. And Mary, her rival, who lived a life of turbulence, scandal, and blood yet died in crimson robes, creating an image that would outlast Elizabeth's careful calculations. History has debated Mary Stuart for centuries. Was she a schemer who brought about her own downfall, or a victim of forces beyond her control? Was she guilty of her husband's murder, or framed by ambitious lords? Was she reckless, Or simply too human in a world that demanded cold steel and endless patience? What is certain is this: Mary, Queen of Scots, refused to fade quietly into obscurity. Her story, woven with passion, betrayal, ambition, and tragedy, became one of the most compelling dramas of the 16th century. She lost her throne, her freedom, her life, but in death, she gained something far more enduring. She became legend. And even now, more than 4 centuries later, her crimson-clad figure on the scaffold remains one of history's most haunting images, a reminder that thrones are fragile, power is fleeting, but stories of defiance and dignity never truly die. And so ends the story of Mary Stuart, Queen, prisoner, and martyr. She lived with crowns upon her head and chains upon her wrists, betrayed by husbands, nobles, and fate itself. Yet even as the axe fell, she claimed a kind of victory, transforming her death into legend. But one question lingers, echoing across the centuries. Was Mary, Queen of Scots, truly the architect of her own downfall, or was she a victim of forces too powerful for any one woman to resist? Tell us what you think. Share your theories in the comments below. We want to know how you see her story. And remember, some stories were never meant to stay buried. Don't let them vanish, keep them alive with us. Secret historians.